Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Wallace. I just wanted to do this short video about Reconstruction to help you with some of the questions, the 4 questions that were on that Google Doc last week. This is just a brief video to go over some of those main points. But before I get into that, thanks again for talking about some of the stress at BCA and some of the issues related to mental health. And how it relates to BCA in our community. And I appreciated that, and I did take some time to share some of your concerns with some other members of the staff. And I think a lot of people were talking about it on Thursday and Friday, so I definitely see some momentum for us to, as a community, use this as a good opportunity. So I'm not in school today, but I will be in school tomorrow, and we can touch base again about that. But this video is a little bit more, again, about Reconstruction for the purpose of just laying out some of the background context about the presidential Reconstruction, which we talked a little bit about in class, and the ways that the radical Republicans respond to presidential Reconstruction, and also the proposal that the radicals develop. And ultimately, that's what happens by 1867 in the South, is the radical Republicans' version of Reconstruction. So just a couple of things to remind you about presidential Reconstruction. Remember that President Andrew Johnson is somebody who was on the ticket in 1864. He was vice president for Lincoln, and after Lincoln was assassinated, Johnson becomes the president. But he had been really a political pick to get Lincoln elected, and so he is a white supremacist, somebody who is from Kentucky, a Jacksonian Democrat, not really a true Republican. He was, somebody who had been a slaveholder, did free his slaves, but also, despite that, was also a unionist, somebody who wanted to return the southern states to the Union. So he saw secession as something problematic, and that's why he had been on the ticket. And it's also something that he will drive that issue during the time, moving into Reconstruction. He wanted to move the South back into the North and make it basically as easy as possible. And we had watched a video clip in class, and there was some information on that video about his particular plan. So I'm just going to note a few things about Johnson's plan, just to remind you. This was one of the questions on the Google Doc also, so you can look and see if some of this is information you feel comfortable with. A few things that really are features. He does create, first of all, he does his Reconstruction plan to let the South back into the North when the Congress is not in session. So this is really presidential Reconstruction in its finest. There's no congressional participation whatsoever. There is a loyalty oath that former Confederates had to take in order to ensure that they could be given amnesty. So part of the issue is how much individuals who are part of the Confederacy should pay a price for their participation. He does make a caveat for individuals who are large-scale property holders. They have to apply directly in Washington, D.C. to President Johnson to get a pardon. And it becomes something that he does, because he is kind of elitist, but also very much, feeling like he's in some degree of competition with wealthy Confederate planters. So he has them come and grovel for their pardons, but they do get pardons. So the really big takeaway with Johnson's plan is that most of the Confederates are going to be eligible to vote, eligible to participate in office, and ultimately eligible to serve, in the U.S. Congress, which is exactly what we see. The other thing that occurs is that there is a process for the former Confederate states to become states in the Union, back in the United States. And this involves taking on the 13th Amendment, so that becomes a condition. And that means that each state will commit to never having slavery. But there also will be state constitutions. So there are these temporary governors, and statewide conventions to create new state constitutions. And because we have a lot of former Confederates, designing those constitutions, we know for the most part that they're going to be limited in scope. And this is especially related to issues of equality and rights for freed people. These are constitutions that aren't going to grant a great deal of justice, in that balance of healing and justice. If we look at some of the effects, of course, we know that there is going to be large numbers of people in Congress, like Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederacy, is going to serve in Congress. So not only at the state level will there be a lot of former Confederates, but also at the federal level in Congress. The growing Northern alarm and growing Republican alarm becomes even more significant when there's a realization that some of the Southern constitutions are not really going to offer any degree of rights for free people. All of the pardons, continually get, set. So more and more former Confederates, holding political office. And there is a great deal of efforts that Southern lawmakers and Southern constitutions are going to make to not only not grant freed people rights, but to deprive people of greater rights. And we see in particular a few places where this is the case. And this is where we could look to some of the primary sources that you looked at in class. For example, there were two primary sources that were about land holding. And this is a really significant issue, because the 4 million freed people who for the first time have the ability to create their own sustainable economic situation. They can farm their own land with the skill set they have. They don't have access to land, and without literacy, without any financial means, it becomes very difficult. And there were some very limited opportunities for freed people during the war to be granted land. We saw this in a primary source with William Tecumseh Sherman, one of the Union generals, granting small numbers of freed people in Georgia land. What we see in the time period of presidential Reconstruction is any land that had been granted to freed people oftentimes gets taken back once there are Confederate or former Confederate claims to that land. The land had been abandoned, then given to freed people, and then when the former Confederates wanted their land back under the Johnson Reconstruction Plan, largely it's the former Confederates that are getting their land back. Of course, and in some of the sources, you can look at the two sources related to land. There are claims by freed people that their families had worked the land for generations and deserved and had some kind of significant right to that land as much as the owners of the land might. And it becomes a little bit of a reference to what the meaning of slavery really was. This entire time period where people had labored, what was that going to be valued in this society, in this new society, and that land issue becomes very significant. The other thing, and we'll look at this document in class on Tuesday, is the Black Codes. And they really vary by state. So every single state that was formerly in the Confederacy is really creating what at one time was slave codes. Now are going to be described as the Black Codes, but they have a very similar, kind of purpose. Some of this is about maintaining the workforce for white planters so that there becomes a lot of opportunities embedded within the Black Codes for white planters to hold formerly freed people into some type of, essentially servitude in some cases, with pay. But the Black Codes are incredibly limiting for African Americans. They limit the movement. They limit what kind of behavior can be conducted in the society. Black Codes would have limited and provided punishments for example, for something like intermarriage. And the Black Codes, in the case of Mississippi's Black Codes, which is what the excerpts that you looked at in the sources that you had, not only do certain laws against things like intermarriage, they also create punishments for both blacks and whites, and there are definitions embedded within the black codes regarding what it means to be black. And so there's descriptions of freed people being held to a standard that's going to be very different than whites. There's also free black people. So even individuals in the South who had never been enslaved but are black find themselves victimized by the black codes. And there's also, the derogatory word of mulattoes that's referenced in here. And there's very clear descriptions in the Mississippi codes of exactly, who is black. And there are punishments for both blacks and for whites in the case, for example, of intermarriage. But the issue in the black codes is that there's a huge, legal format for oppression. And again, we'll look at the Mississippi excerpts tomorrow. But some things about the purpose of the black codes, they're really restoring a whole entire, system of race relations where white planters are going to have the upper hand and can largely control using, in this case, the economic situation of, formerly enslaved persons, holding them, on the plantations in some cases where they had been enslaved. And this is also continuing a largely black labor force in the South. There's also the issue of sharecropping, which we'll also mention a little bit more tomorrow. But we see formerly freed people not really able to access a lot of their own land, not having the economic means to do that. So in an effort to try to enable economic sustainability, we see tenant farming, degrees of different kinds of sharecropping. And this means, really not having any land, taking on what becomes almost like feels a little bit like a feudal system where the formerly enslaved people are using portions of, in a lot of cases, the former slaveholders' land, farming some of that land, and in a lot of cases, keeping a minimal amount for themselves, and some other, very, very small economic benefits. Most of the economic benefits gained from the sharecroppers' land, went to the slaveholders. There's a great deal of limitations on sharecroppers because they have to pay for their own equipment. They have to take care of their own things. They have to do all of the labor. It's in some cases not lucrative. In most cases not lucrative at all. The other things about the time period with the Reconstruction is the presidential Reconstruction. We have the huge Okay, sorry about that. It just got interrupted for a second. The other issue that is important to understanding presidential Reconstruction is the way in which Congress is going to push back against the president's plan. And at first, they really do try to work with the president, and they actually pass two pieces of legislation under presidential Reconstruction to ensure that free people will have some more rights. Their first one is just a continuation of the Freedmen's Bureau. This is really going to extend that agency that's going to deal with abandoned land and the agency that's going to support freed people. That's something that the Republicans in Congress pass, and these are both radical and moderate Republicans. The second piece of legislation that they end up passing is really significant. It's called the 1866 Civil Rights Act. This is really a significant act because it establishes citizenship for all persons born in the United States. It also creates really an end to any type of laws that would treat people differently based on race. So laws that have different punishments, laws that have different rules for African Americans. That's something that would be a violation of the Civil Rights Act. President Johnson does ultimately veto the Civil Rights Act and the continuation of the Freedmen's Bureau bill. So these vetoes become really surprising to the Republicans, and they recognized at that time that some of these rights would have to be enshrined more in the Constitution, and we see the development of the 14th Amendment. Okay, I'm going to stop there for a second, continue with a couple of things in the second part of this video, and it'll be a little shorter than this one. Okay, so it won't be as long. It's just an overview.